Good evening and welcome to the City Club Live pre-debate special presented by the Cleveland Foundation in partnership with Cleveland Young Professional Senate and ideastream. I'm Nick Castele. We are live in the Westfield Insurance Studio Theater at the Idea Center at Playhouse Square. Tonight we will see and hear the first official debate in the Democratic primary race. There have already been 2 debates on the Republican side, 4 really if you count the smaller second-tier debates separately. On the Democratic side, there are far fewer candidates, so there is just one event. The candidates, of course, are the presumptive frontrunner and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, former Virginia Senator Jim Webb, former Governor of Maryland Martin O'Malley, and former Governor of Rhode Island and former Republican Lincoln Chafee. And that's the order they're also polling in. As far as we know, Vice President Joe Biden has not entered the race. In about an hour, coverage of tonight's debate in Las Vegas begins on CNN, which is producing the debate. And we're going to take the next hour here to discuss the issues in the race with our panel here and with our audience. In the second half of the program, we'll be taking questions from the audience, and we also welcome questions on Twitter as well. You can tweet them at the City Club and use the hashtag, and listen closely, CLELECTION 2016. That's CLELECTION 2016, just one E in the middle there. So if you've got that straight, it's time to meet our panelists. To my left, Erika Anthony is the founding member of the Cleveland Young Professional Senate, and by day she's Senior Director of Advocacy, Policy, and Research for Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. Dr. Daniel Coffey is an Associate Professor and Fellow at the University of Akron's Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics. And Michael J. Ensley. Dr. Michael J. Ensley is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Kent State University. Thank you all for sitting down and having this conversation. Thank you. I wanted to start with the 2 highest polling candidates in the room here when we begin this debate in an hour here. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. They've attracted the most attention in this race so far, and I'd like all of us here as a panel to talk about what are the challenges that they've faced as candidates and how are they differing from one another in the issues that they have addressed. Erika, could you start us off?
Sure. So I think for Hillary, particularly the email scandal, we've heard much about this over some time. And I think tonight particularly, she really needs to lift up and uprise above that. She needs not to come across defensive and just be a straight shooter. Like, yeah, I had it. I had a separate email account, and this is the deal.
And this was that she was sending and receiving emails from a private server that she was running when she was Secretary of State, right?
That is correct. I think particularly with Sanders, he needs to come across relatable. People need to feel connected that this man could potentially be the chief of our country. And I think, because coming from a smaller state and not having as vast experience as some of the other candidates, he just hasn't been on the forefront. And I think tonight he needs to demonstrate what his position is, what his positions are as relates to the critical issues facing our nation right now, and really show folks that he is capable of leading this great nation.
Daniel Coffey, we've got Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton both appealing to the Democratic base right now, but there are also many different factions that they're trying to appeal to within this broader tent of Democrats. Can you talk a little bit about how these 2 candidates are trying to do that?
Right. Well, to a large extent, the political parties still, contrary to conventional wisdom, control the nomination, just not quite the same way that they used to. Clinton is really the establishment candidate, and her job is to try to reassure many in the establishment of the Democratic Party that not only is she capable of winning the nomination, but that she would be a solid general election candidate. Sanders represents the more progressive wing of the party that's, you could say, has existed since George McGovern. They've always had one candidate per election cycle, whether it's McGovern or Obama or Paul Tsongas or someone like that. Typically, with the exception of Obama, those candidates don't typically win the nomination. So Sanders is trying to make the argument that not only is he ideologically in step with the Democratic activists, but that he could then appeal to a general electorate. And Clinton's hope here is that she can establish herself and say, look, I'm more moderate, I'm more mainstream, he's over on the fringe.
And Michael Ensley, are there issues at this point in which we've seen Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders take different positions?
Yes, I think there are a few things to sort of point to. I think on most issues they do share a similar sort of progressive liberal sort of stance. But recently, I think one issue that Bernie Sanders will particularly point to is the free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Hillary once said while she was Secretary of State that this is sort of a gold standard of trade agreements, and she's sort of backtracked from that now and is sort of not backing the current agreement. So that's one area, though, I think Bernie will be happy to point their differences. I think another sort of potential area is gun control. Bernie Sanders, although he holds many progressive liberal stances, gun control is one where he's not so liberal, and that partly coming from where he comes from, Vermont. So that will be one area I think Hillary Clinton will want to talk about. And then one other potential, I think, big area of difference, well, two other areas. One, I think, would be potentially climate change, and particularly the Keystone Pipeline. And then finally, with respect to foreign policy. Hillary is known for being a bit more aggressive with respect to foreign policy, more interventionist. Bernie Sanders is very proud that he was one of the few to sort of vote against the sort of Iraq war when he's a member of the House. So I expect those differences to be highlighted tonight.
Mm-hmm. Daniel Coffey, could you fill us in just a little bit on the others who will be in this debate? We've got Martin O'Malley, Lincoln Chafee, and former Virginia Senator Jim Webb, polling kind of at the bottom of the heap right now, but they will be on this stage. This will be their opportunity to introduce themselves to people who didn't know them before. Who are they? What do we have to learn from them?
I can't remember where I saw the article today, but it was about the fact that there's really only one actual Democrat running in the nomination right now, that everybody else is from outside of the party. Jim Webb, former Secretary of the Navy in the Reagan administration, former senator. He is I'd say more in the center of the Democratic Party. Particularly his expertise would be in foreign policy issues, which the other candidates are not particularly strong on. Martin O'Malley is the former mayor of Baltimore, governor of Maryland, has taken fairly uniformly liberal positions so far in this campaign. And I am so sorry, I'm having a Rick Perry moment.
Lincoln Chafee?
Lincoln Chafee, thank you.
Not a good sign for him today.
No, Lincoln Chafee, the former Republican governor, actually, of Rhode Island, and converted to the Democratic Party. Again, he's more in step with, probably ideologically more in step with the Democratic Party now. But again, his past not very well connected. And there is a reason for that, by the way, that many of the establishment candidates, the Andrew Cuomos of the world, and people like that who might be more a stiffer challenge, understood that the party establishment was behind Clinton and stayed out of the race this time because of that.
Erika Anthony, I wanted to ask you if you could draw on your experience with Cleveland Neighborhood Progress a little bit. You know, we're all Northeast Ohioans here in the room watching this debate, listening on the radio and online. Are there particular issues that you think that we face here in the Cleveland area in Northeast Ohio that you might hope would be addressed tonight, or think that we should be looking out for in this debate tonight?
Most certainly. Dan, when he opened up this evening, referenced community policing. We were recently issued the consent decree here in the city of Cleveland, not just here in the city of Cleveland, but other cities like Ferguson and Baltimore and many others, unfortunately, have been dealing with violence. I think this particularly has to be an issue that's discussed tonight. While it might seem more localized, and we sort of feel the heat here in Cleveland, particularly with the recent rage of murders that have been taking place, it really speaks to some desperation for our citizens, and why things like income equality, why issues of advancement and the way people are able to position themselves for success, it all ties back to violence. It's rare that folks are just randomly performing these acts. It's mostly out of desperation, and we have some really impoverished neighborhoods here in the city of Cleveland. As referenced earlier, I work at Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, where that's our role. We work with the CDCs throughout the city of Cleveland, looking at these issues, figuring out how we can uplift and empower the citizens of the city of Cleveland. And while we're a large county, really thinking about that urban core is critical. So I think for sure community policing has to come up, and my fellow panelists referenced gun control, and that's directly linked to that.
And on the issue of policing for a second, both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have faced pressure from the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements related to bring a policy response to the table to deal with shootings and other deaths in custody by police of African American men and women. How have those two candidates dealt with the pressure they face to address those issues?
Particularly for Hillary, Clinton, I know for certain that she has made strides here in Cleveland, particularly reaching out to the African American community. Recently, Sanders introduced some legislation related to racial integration. So I think they're both sort of softly playing the field as it relates to that. But as we know, when it comes to the cohort of voters that are going to come out next year, both candidates and whichever candidate ends up being the nominee needs to particularly look at the African American segment and think about, what are the issues that are pertinent to them and how is that going to impact their connection. I think, having the lens of equity, not just for African Americans, but for the entire nation is critical to, things like economic development and community development, and how do people actually feel empowered and feel that they are critical to the fabric of our nation.
And Daniel Coffey, how have you seen these candidates address issues like that? I think sometimes in the national debate you don't hear urban issues talked about a ton. I mean, how have you seen the candidates sort of position themselves on those issues?
Well, in general, I think Martin O'Malley probably would have the strongest credibility in dealing with urban issues, but unfortunately, his background is somewhat mixed, right? So he has he and Hillary both could, in their past, would have a tough on crime record that perhaps is not as consistent with the Democratic Party base, especially given police violence or violence associated with police brutality. So I think that's a concern. Sanders and Chafee don't really have much of a record at all to really draw on. So for the most part, it's kind of difficult, and I think Michael pointed to this. It's kind of they're trying to carefully tease out differences in which it's very hard for them ideologically to say, oh, we're different here, I would do this or do that. Clinton probably has the strongest and the most detailed policy record here to draw on.
Michael Ensley, could you address something as a point that Erika just made, that these candidates are going to, one possible electoral strategy for winning here is to put together the same coalition that President Obama did to win the presidency 2 times. Yes. And yet, at the same time, candidates may also be trying to distance themselves from the president's policies or records where they might think that would be advantageous to them or what they believe in. Could you explain a little bit about the challenge that they face with building the Obama coalition while also trying to be independent, if they need to be, of his record?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting to note that I think in many ways that Hillary Clinton has sort of tried to step beyond some of Obama's policies in terms of being liberal or progressive. I mean, she's come out adamant about sort of protecting and continuing gay rights. She's been very strong language on gun control. She's pushing, I think, for immigration reform. And so I see her sort of embracing a lot of those aspects. Now, she probably hasn't done, in terms of the coalition, where she has done very well in terms of the primary and where she's stayed strong, is with minority voters. So in many ways, she's done very well with that part of Obama's coalition. Where she's lost some support is with sort of white, educated females, and young females in particular. And so in the debate tonight, I see her trying to win some of those people back and sort of trying to motivate that progressive group of people. And I think that's where a lot of her sort of efforts might be focused. With respect to Bernie Sanders, I think he needs, in order to have any chance of winning this, which I think are very slim, he does need to sort of attract minority votes. And so I expect actually there to be a robust discussion, hopefully, about Black Lives Matter and about gun violence and about some of these issues. Because I think Bernie and the other 3 candidates, all think if they're going to make some inroads, that's where they need to make them. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we hear a fair amount about a discussion about that. I think Hillary's well prepared for that, though, so it's going to be difficult for them to get the upper hand on those issues. Mm-hmm.
And Daniel Coffey, let's take a second here and talk about Bernie Sanders a little bit more. You know, his performance in the polls, the size of the crowds that he has attracted, have really put his campaign in the spotlight. And I'm wondering, what is it about the appeal that he's making to voters that you think is animating a lot of Democratic voters and maybe other progressives outside of the party to support him?
I think a big part of it is there's probably 2 main factors, and these probably aren't the only ones, but 2 come to mind. Number one is there is I think a fair distrust within both the Democratic Party, the mass party, and the public in general, of distrust with the whole Clinton entourage, and a feeling that the Clintons represent a part of the party that is perhaps too connected to Wall Street, too connected to the establishment, doesn't truly care about what people, the ordinary people think. Whether that perception is true or not, I think that perception is out there. I think it's also the case that the Democratic Party, and Michael, I won't speak for him, but has some excellent research on factionalism within the parties. And I think part of it is that the party, there is a base of the party. There was a great article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about West Virginia voters and how they really gravitated towards her message. Economic inequality has become a major issue. And when Sanders speaks, it seems to be more authentic than Hillary. After all, it was her husband who repealed Glass-Steagall, which was a core part of the New Deal. I think that Sanders is also, you can think of him as the proxy candidate for Elizabeth Warren. That is the support that people who wanted Elizabeth Warren to run, they can't have her, so Sanders is sort of the stand-in for their vote.
Mm-hmm. Erika Anthony, any thoughts on what it is about Bernie Sanders and the message that he's talking about right now that has animated Democratic voters?
I think particularly to Daniel's point about the income inequality, he has been focusing on more than just uplifting the minimum wage, but I think the challenge for not just Sanders but particularly for Hillary as it relates to women and still the prevailing inequality that relates to the wages of women and salaries of women compared to that of their male counterparts. And I think there's going to be some added pressure as a female contender in how is she particularly going to address that. I think, the economic factors that we have seen over the last 8 years or so, sort of post-recession, some factions of our nation are uplifting and they are, revitalizing themselves, but more often than not, particularly here in Cleveland, we have many still impoverished areas. So I think both Sanders and Hillary need to really hone in and particularly face that and address that, and how are they going to ratify that?
And let's talk for a second about the economy. A huge focus of the 2012 election. On one hand, unemployment now is at 5.5%. It's much lower than it was in 2012. Yet labor force participation is at its lowest level since 1977, and there are people who are seemingly not a part of the labor force anymore. Erika, do you have any thoughts on what is a Democratic candidate to do about this? How are they talking about the economy? On one hand, maybe there are signs of success, but there's also an underside to it as well.
Well, I think not just for the Democratic candidates, but I think as a nation, we need to shift the paradigm as to what is success and how will we impart the education into individuals to actually prepare them for the industries that are cultivating and really taking the forefront. As a wife of an educator, I have this conversation quite often about what opportunities are being availed to the youth in our nation, and I think particularly when you think about unemployment and sort of what areas of our economy are actually thriving, there needs to be a shift in paradigm in how we educate individuals, what type of training opportunities are being availed to individuals, how are we dealing with those that are incarcerated, and how are we preparing them for successful reintegration back into our nation, because we have millions of people sitting in our prisons and they too need to be paid attention to, and how are we cultivating them and preparing them for their reintegration.
Mm-hmm. Daniel Coffey, any thoughts about how the economy is playing out in this election, how these candidates are fielding, the economy that we're facing right now?
I think Erika just hit the nail on the head there. There's a tremendous amount of anxiety amongst voters about not only whether you have a job, will you still have a job? The effects of the recession psychologically are really weighing down on voters. By and large, many Democratic core voters are not doing as well. And these voters are anxious, and I mean everyone from somebody from the inner cities to the coal mines in West Virginia and further out, that there's concern, and so I think Sanders really taps into that. As the economy recovers, by and large, this should bode well for any Democratic candidate because they will essentially be the incumbent party running for re-election. But that sort of movement is going to push the Democratic Party to take more consistently liberal positions. And again, things like the TPP and other sort of what I might call establishment positions might be more problematic if the primary goes on for too long.
Michael, go ahead, please.
I would sort of add to that. I think what you'll see tonight from Bernie Sanders is he'll make the argument, I think, that yes, Hillary and I and Barack Obama, for that matter, share many of these same concerns and same policies, and we'd like to do the same things. But I think the argument that Sanders will want to make is that we've worked with Obama for 8 years, and yet we still have a severe economic inequality problem. And he'll argue that he's the person to sort of take us above and beyond that, where he wants to sort of not change the way Washington works, but sort of have the people sort of rise up and sort of fight, these sorts of issues, because he'll paint Hillary as the establishment who's sort of working within the system and doing things incrementally. And he'll want to make the argument that that doesn't work. We need a change in how our politics sort of work. And so you'll see them, advocating for the same thing, but almost just offering different strategies, I think, in some ways. Whereas Hillary, on the other hand, will say, I've worked in Washington, I know how to get things done. I'm the one who, has a reasonable sense of what it will take to get these things done.
And Mike Lenz, let me stay with you for just 1 second. I think that the factions within the Republican Party have found themselves in a pretty harsh spotlight right now, given the debate over who will become Speaker of the House, or who even wants to become Speaker of the House. But there are also lots of factions within the Democratic Party as well. Could you give us a primer on who would consider themselves Democratic voters, and what are the different factions at play here for these candidates?
Well, I like to think that there are sort of two major factions within the Democratic Party. I think there are what we might call the true liberals, consistent liberals, or maybe the progressives. Those who want not only sort of to deal with economic inequality and all the issues related to that, but also want to see advances in a liberal direction with regards to civil rights, with regards to both with African Americans and minorities, also with respect to gay rights and many of those sorts of issues. And you could throw, I think, abortion in there as well. I think there's another segment of the Democratic Party which we might label more populist, that has sort of more of the working class part of the Democratic Party, which may not share all of the sort of more socially liberal positions that you find among sort of progressives. But you will find a lot of the union sort of workers and the working class people that I sort of mentioned. And so I see those are sort of the two major factions that that they're fight on. And of course there are other specific issues, there are issues that cross-cut like free trade and gun control and to a lesser extent immigration. But I see those as the two major factions that these candidates are fighting for, at least in the primary process.
Mm-hmm. One question I want to ask all of you. There's one person looming over this debate who will not be on the stage, and that's Vice President Joe Biden. We were joking before about how he might enter dramatically in the middle of the debate. Erika, what exactly is at stake here for the Vice President? He has not yet announced, but he's certainly made it very clear that he's thinking about it.
Right. Well, according to what I read earlier, he is busy at 8:30. We'll see what that actually means. We were also joking about the fact that they're leaving room on the stage for the sixth podium, just in case he comes through. I think, thinking about these last 8 years is really critical when we think about Biden, particularly around just the believability and also the connection to people. And I know as a very committed voter, I've yet to feel that with our candidates at this point. And I know it's early on, but I felt like in previous elections, that feeling, that sort of energy was already in me. And I think Biden brings that. I mean, who does not like Biden, right? I mean, he just brings that energy. I think particularly when we think about millennial voters, and I know we're representing Young Professional Senate tonight, there's a connection there, and there's a want to see change and believe that change can actually come. So I think people are positively, anxiously awaiting for him to really step up. And it'll be interesting these next couple weeks to see how that pans out.
Daniel Coffey, what role could Biden play in this race if he were to get in? Or what role does his absence play in this race? Let's start there.
I think the attention to Biden really is the anxiety that many Democratic voters feel about Hillary Clinton. That, in other words, if everyone on the Democratic side felt the way felt strongly about Clinton, confident about her, he really would have no sway here. His name would not be mentioned. He is there as sort of the fail-safe. If everything goes wrong, if this email scandal, if something else comes out about the Clintons that we don't know about, who do we turn to? There's discomfort that Bernie Sanders is going to be the right guy. Certainly, the other candidates don't have the credibility. So Biden would be that kind of establishment candidate who understands Washington, who looks at the average voter. Okay, we can feel safe voting for you. A lot of voters do like the reassurance that a candidate can actually handle the job, and Biden would represent that. The problem for him is that the endorsements which have been piling up, the money's been piling up. There is a point at which what we call the invisible primary starts to become the actual visible primary, and we're getting too close to that for a Biden candidacy to really mean it, to be credible.
Michael Ensley, another part of the Biden story is that he brings with him a long track record, a long history in the Senate. And one element of that that's been under more focus, I think, recently has been his record on criminal justice, his tough on crime record from the 90s as a Democrat. And now, as I think public opinion has begun to shift on that issue, maybe it doesn't look the same as it did back then. Could you talk about how that might play into this race?
I certainly think that can matter. I mean, I think that if Biden were to enter the race, I think he would sort of kind of pull equally from both Sanders and Clinton, maybe a little bit more from Clinton, but not enough to sort of propel his candidacy forward. And frankly, I think that's parenthetically the reason he's not in. I don't think he really sees the way forward for him other than being a spoiler or just another candidate in the race. But if he were to sort of enter, that would certainly become an issue. I think it would certainly heighten the discussion around that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think Hillary's been strong with minority groups, and I think that only would sort of, I think, hinder his sort of candidacy. I mean, I think also another area where his track record would come up is with regards to sort of Iraq and sort of his sort of involvement on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and his sort of role in that. And I don't think that would work too kindly in his favor either. So I think there's a few things in his past that wouldn't work so well for him.
Mm-hmm. We've also had, in just the past few weeks here, on a totally different issue, there have been shootings at schools in Oregon, in Arizona as well, in addition to numerous other shootings in Cleveland, other cities like that. How have these candidates addressed gun control and gun rights in this campaign? Daniel Coffey, would you take a stab at that?
Well, so Bernie Sanders probably, some of my own research plays on this because I look at what are called state party platforms. The state parties issue their own platforms in addition to the national party. The state parties, there's more diversity within the Democratic Party on gun control. So at the national level, Democrats are in favor of gun control. But when you go below the surface, many Democrats, I had a discussion with my students the other day, many liberal Democratic 20-year-olds, when you start to talk about gun control, their positions change, right? The language changes. Bernie Sanders, probably as much as he's seen as more conservative on gun control, probably isn't out of step with many, I wouldn't call them activist Democrats, but more moderate voters who might show up in a general election. Hillary has, her positions have shifted over time, but generally speaking, let's say Martin O'Malley is probably the most, currently the most liberal in terms of pushing for gun control. I think what Clinton's probably trying to do now is to that's one way she can distinguish herself from Sanders and say, no, look, I'm more in favor of gun control. My husband was in favor of gun control. You know, the Obama administration is in favor of gun control. Look at Sanders; he's out of step with you guys on the left. That's probably the way that I would see this playing out tonight. I don't know if either of you have more to add.
Erika, I mean, we have seen the president deliver very forceful statements, especially after the shooting at Umpqua Community College in Oregon, calling for more gun safety, gun control measures, and yet if you look at the actual policies that have changed, not much has. No. Do you think that these candidates have brought forward at this point any means to address that issue? Do you think it's something that they want to take a stand on?
I think they will speak up tonight. I don't think I've seen thus far any strong positions outside of what Daniel just noted. But I think, again, thinking about the different factions within the citizenry and sort of who they need to gain support from, young adults. I mean, no one should be fearful of going to class. No one should be fearful of going to a student union. And those are voters. And these candidates in particular need to understand, what are the issues for millennials, for younger adults, that are important to them, student loan debt, things of that nature, and safety is critical. So I think they do have to put forth a more concrete plan to address or how they will address gun control and gun rights in our nation.
I want to let our audience know here in the studio, as well as those listening on 90.3 WCPN and online, We will be going to the questions portion of this conversation in just about a minute here. So start thinking about your questions. Be brave. Don't be afraid to get up there in front of a microphone or tweet us a question, because we really do want to hear from you. Before we do, I want to go to Michael Ensley. Let's talk about, just for a moment here, Hillary Clinton and her emails. Is she going to be asked about this tonight, do you think?
I think she will be asked about it. And I think Erika gave the right strategy for her earlier, which is to try to give an honest, quick answer to it and sort of move on. Because I think the best thing for Hillary is to sort of just try to address the issue in a straightforward manner and not dwell on it. I think for her, her strong point will be talking about issues, talking about policy, and moving away from it. I don't think her opponents will want to raise it and bring it up with her. I think they want to stay out of that fray. And so I think it will come up. I think I'm sure she's thought about how to address this in a quick and efficient way to try to deal with all the criticism. Frankly, though, Kevin McCarthy did her the best favor possible when, he pointed out that the Benghazi committee in the House was, potentially geared towards, targeting her and her political ambitions and not actually about investigating the issue. And so, thankfully for her, I think a lot of what needs to be dealt with was done by him.
And President Obama also recently was asked about it, and he referred to her using this private email server as a mistake, but then said that he thought it did not harm national security. How do you think that will play in here?
I think it does play to her favor, and I don't think this is the type of issue that will stick with voters. Unless there's something very specific revealed in these emails, or there's something very specific that she was trying to hide that comes out. If it's just an issue if she used a private email server, I just don't see how it resonates with voters in the long term.
You've been listening to a pre-debate conversation with the City Club of Cleveland before the Democratic debate this evening, listening on 90.3 WCPN or on our live stream. We'll now be turning to the audience to welcome you into this conversation with your questions, which we'll do our best to answer. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Philip Hediatnia, and I'm the chair of the City Club's Youth Council. And what I wanted to ask was, in all of the discussions about what's going to happen tonight and how it's going to affect the campaign, there's also a lot of reports about how Hillary Clinton has locked up delegates already, how already so many members of Congress have already backed her. So what could conceivably happen tonight that could allow someone like Sanders or O'Malley to surge ahead of her in the primary race?
Daniel Coffey?
I don't think much, to be honest. I mean, there's a bit of a ritual element here, right? So that the party is largely, as you mentioned, with endorsements. I think Hillary outnumbers Sanders 100 to 2 or 150 to 2 or something like that. And as political scientists, we know that that's the party making what we often say, the party decides. That's how they decide. There is a bit of an audition here that's Clinton's role is largely just reassuring people. That's her job tonight. It's okay, I've got this, I can handle it. And some of it is road testing messages, right? So you make somebody go through almost a dress rehearsal for the general election. And there is some benefit to the party to doing that and having a competitive primary. But a lot of this is ritualistic, to be honest.
Yeah,
I
would agree with that. But I would also say I think that it does matter. I think it matters in how Hillary in particular handles the questions that she gets tonight. And I think, other than avoiding mistakes, I think the thing that her campaign is worried about and trying to do is two things which might be in tension. One is position herself well for the general election and whoever she competes against, but also to keep her base excited and keep those people involved in the campaign, want to be part of the campaign, to show up on election day, to keep the Obama coalition alive, the thing that Obama did so well. So that's the thing I think she has to sort of thread and deal with. And so I think the debate matters in that larger sense. But in terms of the other candidates surging ahead, other than Hillary making a huge mistake or new information being revealed, I don't see the path forward for the others.
Erika?
No, I mean, really nothing further to add. I think, that likability, as I referenced earlier, is going to be critical, specifically with the millennial voters and the younger voters, in making sure that connectivity is there. The three other candidates outside of Sanders, I mean, their polling is non-significant. I mean, it's so dismal that there would really have to be something bizarre come out tonight in order for them to really fly ahead.
Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.
We've got another question here from our audience. Yes.
Okay. Hi, good good evening at this point. Will Tarter, and I'm an undecided Democrat. And one of the things I wanted to say is I really appreciated earlier the discussion about if Joe Biden enters the race, whom he would pull votes from. So my question is a two-part question. The first one is, how many undecided Democrats do you think there are? Is there data that suggests how many undecided Democrats there are still out there? And number two, is there anything that the panel thinks could happen tonight that would clinch any undecided Democrats tonight? So is there anything that you would be looking for that would say, yes, I think undecided Democrats would really rally behind this, or do you think they'll hold out after this debate is over and to make up their mind? Thank you.
Michael Ensley, are there undecided Democrats out there?
There certainly are. I don't know if I can put a very hard number on it, but I can, for example, tell you that I did see some recent polling evidence that suggested over the course of the summer, about 75% of the people who said they would vote for Clinton decided to stay with Clinton. So that means she lost about a quarter of her original supporters over the course of the summer. So I think that gives you some idea about, the extent to which people are malleable. So that it's a large group. I also think, though, that a lot of voters still aren't paying very deep attention. And so even if there are voters who have announced positions and don't say they're undecided, I think there are a lot of malleable voters. And so I think there are people that could certainly change. With respect to what sort of issue it could sort of be, there might be some very specific issues, whether it's something like gun control, maybe immigration might be another sort of potential issue, but I don't see any one single issue that could swing a large segment back and forth, just a bunch of small groups that could be moved.
Mm-hmm. Erika, anything to add to that?
I would say it's too early. I can't really see folks making a decision if they are in fact undecided at this point. Again, it would have to be something really out of the box for the candidates to come forth this evening. I think there's such little information for us to go off of right now. I don't imagine or can't imagine that so much information would be shared tonight that all of a sudden I'm like, yes, this is who I'm going for. I think, we definitely need some time. Obviously, the other party has been taking a lot of the media, so the Democratic candidates definitely need to come forth a little bit stronger so people actually know what their positions are.
Daniel Coffey, if I could just ask a spin-off question here from that one. What importance to selecting a Democratic nominee does the primary have? How influential are these primary elections and caucuses in deciding the Democratic nominee?
Well, they're very important in a competitive environment. In other words, on the Republican side, they're critical. They will decide the nominee. But again, going back to what we call the invisible primary, in this sense, when you have a firm establishment candidate, the primaries will be less important. Michael referenced factions within the Democratic Party. Those are fairly enduring. So I would expect that Sanders should continue on into some of the primaries and caucuses, but odds are that by March or so, he'll have to give up the ghost and admit defeat. And at that point, it becomes more about sort of establishing a claim on the major candidate, sort of a Ted Kennedy 1980. I'm going to stay in and try and make you pay attention to these issues that you might not want to talk about, so that when the general election comes, you've at least made some policy commitments to the progressive wing of the party.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please, your question.
Hi, my name's Cassandra Jackson. One of the issues that I haven't heard any of you address is how any of the candidates are going to address the issue about religion. A lot of the Republican candidates are speaking about a Christian nation and different things of that sort. How do you think we should address it, or who should address it in this debate, if at all?
That's right. Ben Carson made a lot of headlines when he was asked if he thought he would support a Muslim American being president, and I believe he said no. Erika, on the Democratic side, how do you think religion might play into this race?
I think at this point, at least as I have seen, particularly with the past Republican debates, as a citizen, it made me uncomfortable, I'll be honest. And I think just personally for me, religion is a very personal journey. And to me, as a nation that's so diverse, so full of different faiths, You don't want to discredit or minimize or diminish the value of anyone's religion. So I think candidates, both Republican and Democrat, have to be very careful in taking strong positions on one faith over another faith. I like to keep it a little cleaner and keep that out of the conversation personally.
Michael Ensley, how do you think religion might play in on the Democratic side? Certainly something discussed among Republicans, but among Democrats?
I don't anticipate it to sort of play a very big role, but bringing up Biden again, that would be one interesting place, is Biden being Catholic. That is one place he could sort of pull some sort of support. So if he were to enter, I could see a little bit more discussion around some of those issues and that sort of emerging, but I don't see it playing out in sort of a large, significant way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir, your question.
Hi, my name is Rodney Mason, and my question is pretty straightforward, but I don't know if this is going to be addressed as too early or not in the process, but do you expect either any of the candidates to perhaps talk about how Congress is set up and the current state of Congress and how they intend to work with Congress, because obviously our current president is having difficulty with that. So how do they expect to bridge that situation?
Right, the president having trouble working with Congress and Congress now having trouble working with itself. Michael Ensley, how does Congress play into this?
Let me try to answer that at least for Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders was on Meet the Press on Sunday morning, and this exact question was posed to him. And he said his approach would be to dealing with Congress is basically trying to mobilize people and the electorate. Because from his perspective, that sort of working with the Congress hasn't worked. And so he thinks the best way to get progressive causes through is by having the people sort of protest, rise up, and sort of create a mass movement. And so the ultimate form, I guess, of sort of going public, and that was sort of his answer to it. I think Hillary's going to sort of give the opposite answer, in that she knows in the reality of our system that this is what we have to work with, and she's the one who can sort of manage that and could potentially sort of be most successful. So I see them trying to play that exact question off of each other tonight and provide those answers.
Daniel Coffey, any ways in which you think, especially the sort of the dysfunction and the debating right now within the Republican Party, they control Congress and yet are very divided right now and don't even know who's going to be in charge, and yet they control Congress. How does that play into, you think, Democrats now talking about how they would govern?
Oh, I think it's a winning issue for them. Running against Congress has always been, for any presidential candidate, a great way to run. I think for Clinton especially, it's difficult because she has friends in the Senate. I mean, she would count John McCain as a personal friend. But the legacy of the Clintons is that they don't like her especially. And so for her to sort of sidestep the issue of how can I work with the Republican Congress, if they didn't like Obama, they're certainly not going to like me, would be essentially we need reform. And to try to say that, look, kind of like Sanders, we need to get more Democratic voters out in 2016. That will be a real part of any Democratic presidential campaign, would be to try to win more congressional seats.
Erika Anthony, anything to add to that?
Nothing further.
Nothing further. Thank you so much. Another question, please.
Hello. My name is Italo Gonzalez. So I have this question, more like I wonder, I like Bernie Sanders, and I think he will be a great president. But as you see the counterpart from the Republicans, or when you see Barack Obama, President Barack Obama, trying to implement some new laws, always the word socialist is what comes around. So I was wondering, and your thoughts, when socialist will be stop being a bad word for America? Thanks.
Right, for 8 years we had a president, Republicans sometimes accused of being a socialist. Now we have someone who actually openly describes himself as being a democratic socialist running for president. Erika Anthony, the idea of socialism as an issue among Democrats.
I think it will for sure attract some voters, but I think overarchingly it's not going to be the consensus among citizens in our nation. I think Michael might have said this earlier, sort of that far left progressiveness, while that may be a faction of the Democratic Party, I think overarchingly the consensus is around realism and what are the economic divides in our nation. And some of the socialist sort of positions, particularly those that Sanders has brought forth so far, I don't think necessarily appeal to the masses and actually could turn folks off.
Daniel Coffey, Bernie Sanders was even asked on TV recently, are you a capitalist? And he said, I am a democratic socialist. How do you think that question might play out with other candidates?
Well, so I think that for Clinton, the idea would be to play on that as much as possible. Any establishment candidate has a challenger wants to say, look, see, they're unelectable. That word, that word could kill you in the general election. I do wonder for Sanders and his camp if that's a calculated risk. In other words, stake out the position, yeah, I'm a socialist. And if you're not, tell me why you're not, especially for activist voters. The primary electorate is different than the general electorate. And for many Democrats who will be voting in the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary, on down to South Carolina, et cetera, they may be looking for that message. They may that may embolden them. Say, hey, we like that. You're willing to take a stronger position here. So it'll be interesting. I think in general that probably doesn't play well for the mass electorate, but it might work in the primaries for a while.
Michael Ensley, is socialism a dirty word in this election?
It certainly could potentially be. And the thing that I sort of think of and draw on here, I assume that Bernie Sanders is going to get another question about that tonight. My question is, were they going to turn and ask the same question of the other candidates on the panel, and particularly Hillary? And I'm interested to see how she addresses this. And I think back to actually President Obama's first inaugural address. And in there, he's in responding to sort of the question of whether, big government or little government, he sort of pushed that aside and he went on to address the question of the market and what it sort of means. And he said in that address, he said, the market is unmatched for creating wealth and promoting, democracy and the good society. And you couldn't offer a stronger endorsement for a capitalist system. And my question is, how would Hillary sort of address that sort of question? If we come up, are you a socialist? And if you're not, why you are? Well, do you believe in capitalism? So I think that's an interesting sort of question. I expect Bernie to fully embrace it. I think Daniel's right that this is his strategy and his sort of way forward, and he'll be unapologetic about it. But I'm interested to see potentially how Hillary might address that question. Are you a capitalist, a socialist, or something else?
Your question, yes.
Yes, my name is Murat, and I'm from Turkey. I know we have a lot of issues in the U.S. in terms of domestic issues, but how about the foreign policy? Not a lot of candidate talked about foreign policy, Middle East relationship with the EU. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. How do you think foreign policy might play into this, Michael Ensley?
I think it'd be particularly important. One of the ways that Hillary might be, different than some of the other Democrats, not only on the podium but more generally, is that she is perceived as being sort of more aggressive. I don't know if hawkish is the right term, but she certainly is much more willing to, or at least in her language, much more willing to try to use military force, use and be aggressive with respect to foreign policy. And so I expected that to sort of play out. And so, and particularly with what's going on in Syria currently and with Russia's involvement, I think this is a really sort of important issue, and I expect them to get questions tonight about how you would deal with Syria, and specifically how would you deal with Russia and what they're doing in Syria. And I'm very curious to see what their answers are. So I think it could certainly be potential important, and particularly for the general election going forward.
Daniel Coffey, anything to add to that? I think there's been a lot of talk, at least among Republicans, in those debates. How would you talk with Putin? How would you deal with Syria or ISIS? Do you think the same questions or the same framing of those questions would be thrown at the Democrats as well?
Yeah, I think for Clinton, this is, if you think that what hurt her in 2008 was that she was seen as too far to the right on foreign policy, especially her vote in favor of the Iraq War. The fortune spins, and now it looks like makes her a more credible candidate in the general election, because she can actually, this is one of the areas where she can say, I was a bit different than the administration. I wanted us to take a harder line in Syria. And that's going to be a better position for her, not only in tonight's debate, probably in the general election. So that makes her a very credible both primary candidate and general election candidate. For Jim Webb, by the way, this is probably the one issue he could talk about and harp on. So I would expect to hear from him quite a bit. And again, there's someone who has quite a bit of experience. That doesn't mean that he's going to win a lot of support, but that would be his one sort of opening to exploit.
And Erika Anthony, another part of if Hillary Clinton is asked to talk about her time as Secretary of State, I imagine Benghazi may come up as well, the attacks in Benghazi in Libya. How do you think that issue might play out for her? It's one that's been talked about for a while now, especially by Republicans.
Right, for sure. I think the positions that she has taken, particularly with Benghazi, I think to a degree, there's a level of faith in, how she has sort of taken a stance and, sort of stepped forward as it relates to her positions. I think, unlike Webb, the other candidates don't really have that necessarily concrete experience to speak to. And I think that's one of many fashions that, particularly for Clinton and for Webb, that they'll be able to sort of speak to in a more concrete versus a sort of theoretical, conceptual way that may appeal to voters.
Do we have questions here from Twitter? Is that?
This is from Kathleen. Much of the Republican debate focused on Hillary Clinton. How much will she be debating them tonight in absentia?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So most of the Republican debate focused on Hillary Clinton and her candidacy, and so how much tonight is she in turn debating, them in absentia?
Oh, I see. How will she be debating Republicans?
Right.
Is she debating Donald Trump on that stage tonight?
More or less.
Erika, how do you think that Republican attacks on Hillary Clinton might play out in this tonight? Is she going to be debating them on that stage?
I don't see it. It's a different platform, less candidates. I think, the moderators tonight will really be able to focus very specifically on the candidates, ask them very pointed questions. The sort of mockery to a certain degree of the previous debates, I think won't necessarily be represented tonight. I just can't see these particular candidates getting into sort of that bickery that has transpired in the Republican debates.
Daniel Coffey, any, do you think there'd be disagreement among Democrats about how to, address things Republicans have said about them? Seems like an issue they may all unite behind.
Yeah, it's easy. I think again, these issues of electability, what happens when you get in government. I think that the shackles around Clinton will always be: will Republicans take you seriously? What are they going to try impeachment you? 6 weeks into office. What's going to happen if they're going after you when you're not even in office? So that becomes about governability. And I do think that the other candidates may talk about, well, look, maybe people will talk to Jim Webb. Maybe people will talk to, I don't think they'll talk to Lincoln Chafee, but maybe they would. And that would be their sort of opening, is saying, well, look, I don't have all the baggage and I'm not as polarizing a figure. So,
Michael Ensley, nothing to add to that?
No, not in particular.
Not in particular. Yes, your question.
Good evening. With Hillary Clinton being the front runner at the moment, do you think her about turn on the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a tactical move in response to the challenge from Bernie Sanders, or do you think it's a genuine shift to the left? If it's a tactical move, why do you think she feels it's necessary, considering her clear advantage in the national polls at the moment?
Michael Ensley, what is behind her decision to come out against TPP?
Certainly, it's at least partially a tactical move. She, in her own book, said, not recently, that if you're not for this kind of trade agreement, you can't be for any trade agreement. And so she kind of already staked out a very strong position that this would be a good agreement. And so she has sort of backtracked, and I can't see it anything else other than at least as partially a tactical move in worrying about the primary. I think when you move on to the general election, I just don't think she's worried about it as an issue. It's an issue, frankly, that divides Republicans as well as Democrats. And so it's not something that's going to resonate, I think, in the general election, because Republicans face the same sort of difficulties with that issue as well. So I think there's a lot of calculating on both the primary and the general election stage. It was probably the right thing to do for the campaign.
If we can bounce off that question too, Daniel Coffey, another issue where Hillary Clinton has made some headlines on is she came out against Keystone Pipeline, another issue that's divided Democrats, in many different ways. How do you think candidates will be addressing that issue tonight, Keystone Pipeline, and also the environment and climate beyond that?
Generally, the Democratic base is very liberal on environmental issues. That's a very unpopular, not only the Keystone Pipeline, but the anxiety about global climate change is much more severe on the Democratic side. And there's a concern that the Democrats aren't being aggressive enough. So she really has to, I think, make it, again, sort of reassure the activists, I'm with you, I understand you. I think this is one of the areas where Sanders can sound more authentic when he talks about this compared to to Clinton. So she'll have to be careful, though, because these there's sort of what's called opposition research occurs. So during these debates, a candidate says something, and that snippet that you said may appear in a campaign commercial. And especially on the Republican side, this is a tool that an issue Republicans are able to usually use to motivate their voters. So she has to use language that's pro-environment, against the Keystone Pipeline, but she can't say something that's too aggressive because it could come back to haunt her potentially.
Erika Anthony, climate change, do you think Democrats will be called on to talk about that tonight?
I think for sure. I think they will for sure be called upon climate change. I think most recently, again, thinking about particularly about the younger voters, I think these are issues that will speak to them as it relates to what are they going to credit their candidate, the person that they're going to vote for, and sort of how Hillary will separate herself in sort of her previous positions and sort of her more recent positions, and how that has changed, and sort of the justification. Is it tactical? Is it real? Is it just to position herself for the general election? So I think for sure that has to come up tonight.
Mm-hmm. Your question, thank you.
Hi, yes, Becky Evie. I recently just moved back to the area after living in California for 2 years, and you guys kind of stole the thunder from my question, but as you know out there's an incredible drought. There's not been much rain, there's been tons of forest fires, and so my question was very much, do you think the environment's going to play a role in this primary election, or is it more of a general election issue, and what do the Dems have to do to stand out from the Republicans?
Michael Ensley, I think among Republicans often the question is just, do you think it's happening and do you think humans are causing it? For Democrats, do you think they'll be pushed a little bit more to say, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I do think it's an issue that you'll certainly hear a lot more discussion about. It will play, I think, certainly out tonight, I think, as we were just discussing in this. I mean, if there's one positive moment you might get from Lincoln Chafee tonight, and remember, it might be about environment and climate change issues. But I also think it was something that will certainly carry over because it ties so deeply into energy issues and all of these issues. And I expect it to continue to sort of be an issue. And I think it's one of the reasons I think Bernie Sanders thinks he should be here, is to continue to keep those issues going and alive. And even if he thinks he can't win, I think he sees his role to keep discussing those issues and make them part of the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Your question.
I'm curious as to what Republicans and specifically Republican strategists are going to be looking for in tonight's debate.
Daniel Coffey, what's the Republican thinking as they're watching this tonight?
I think what you're looking for, whether it's on climate change, on gun policy, those are the two issues, immigration, that would immediately come out and say, what are the issues that our voters are most either angry or anxious about? And particularly those three issues immediately come to mind. And what would motivate our voters to say, look, what will, say, get you to the polls so that you will vote against, let's say it's Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders? So probably some, not inappropriate language, but a language that a candidate might say, oh, geez, I wish I didn't say it that way. And so there's no confusion on the issue positions. It's more how do we articulate them or how do we phrase them that tend to become an issue in the general election.
So gaffes, are they looking for gaffes?
It's not so much a gaffe, it's the did you really say it that way, as opposed, and sometimes some of these things, it doesn't become apparent for 6 months that, oh, that's how the person phrased it. So, but yeah, they are definitely looking for this typical foot and mouth kind of problem. Yeah.
I do want to say quickly, we've got a couple minutes left, so if you have not asked a question, now is your chance to get up to the microphone. Erika Anthony, any other things that you think Republicans might be looking for in this debate if they're trying to think of how can we get a leg up on the candidate our person will be facing in the general election?
Right. Outside the issues that Daniel mentioned, I think particularly when you think about who are the Democratic voters, and most of which being African American or minority. So they're going to be thinking about, what are the positions that the Democrat candidates lay out tonight that may sort of steer or move positions of African American or minority voters to the Republican Party based upon their positions, particularly around the community policing, particularly around race equity and sort of civil rights issues. I think are some that are going to, for sure, take that undecided voter, and after tonight hearing what the candidates have to say, put them in a position to want to choose who they want to vote for.
We've got time for one more question. Yes.
I just had a comment and a question. Hillary is a very intelligent person. And I'm not used to speaking, excuse me. I feel that she might not just have to run against her own record, but also her husband's record, and what type of effect that might have on issues like Glass-Steagall, his being tough on crime, and NAFTA, and how that would affect her in having to either distance herself or justify some of his past decisions.
It's a good question. We'll have to leave it at that as the. We got some time. Okay, in just a couple seconds, or Michael Ensley, you would take a stab at that.
I think it's going to stay with her. I would add the question of gay rights and don't ask, don't tell. She'll have to live with all of those issues, and they will stay with her. And the Republicans will keep pounding on those, and they'll look for those inconsistencies.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us in this conversation and for listening. This has been a conversation at the City Club of Cleveland pre-debate special. Thank you all.